wonderful discussion on revivals, a little bit of history, because the most well-known revival is the Great Awakening of the 18th century, and there is a reason why it's the most well-known, and that we're going to hopefully get to that in a little while. So we saw last week that there's been revivals in history, awakenings throughout the history of the church, and this will continue in various ways throughout the church age because we are leaky vessels. We need reviving in our spiritual life. The church needs reviving constantly. We get excited for the Lord and then we drift away, and we need to be reformed, realigned back into the ways of the Lord. And the Lord will pour out His Holy Spirit at certain times to do that in small ways, in larger ways, in huge ways sometimes. And the Great Awakening was a huge outpouring of this. So that means that before the Great Awakening, there were precursors to this revival. There were many revivals happening throughout the world, or we're just going to look at a few of them, but there were a lot of mini revivals happening in the 100 years or so before the Great Awakening. And we're going to look at just some of those precursors. There was the Pietist movement in Europe, and especially in Germany in the 17th century. And that's quite important because the Puritan movement morphed into the Pietist movement over the years. One of the most significant men in this movement was a guy called August Hermann Francke. I'll probably mispronounce his name, so I'm sorry about that. Who lived 1663 to 1727 at Hallel in Germany. And he oversaw huge ministries like Bible translations, evangelical training, preaching schools, orphanages, and missionaries. And this guy even corresponded with the Americas with a guy called Cotton Mather, who was a well-known preacher in America at the time, in New England, who's a Puritan, as was really Francke was a Puritan in his theology, about the rise and growth of Pietism. They corresponded with each other. And out of Hallel in Germany came a numerous revivals. It's one of it's in fact out of Hallel in Germany came the revival amongst the Moravians in 1727, who would be so instrumental in John Wesley's life, and we'll mention that again a little later. At the same time, in England, as a precursor, we had a guy called Dr. Anthony Horneck. 1641 to 1697, who was by birth German and had grown up under the Reformed Pietist circles and was living in London. And he is attributed to starting the religious societies movement in England, which became a huge part of church life for decades and decades. The religious society movement were groups of people that gathered under rules, often with strict devotional rules, but they were expected to, members of religious societies were expected to walk the gospel out in life. So feed the poor, visit the poor, even help them find employment, visit those in prison, help educate orphans or those who couldn't read, establish charities. And these grew hugely. By the beginning of the 1700s, there was 40 societies in London alone. And one of the most famous of those societies was called the Holy Club in Oxford, which had members such as John and Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, John Gambold, who became Bishop of the Moravian Church, John Clayton, who became a distinguished Anglican clergyman, James Harvey, who would become a religious writer of some note, Benjamin Ingram, who became a famous evangelist in Yorkshire, and Thomas Broughton, who became the secretary of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. And then there was the famous Fetter Lane Society, where John Wesley became a Christian. So these societies became a huge part of church life and were a precursor to the Great Awakening that would happen about a century later, or between a century... about a century later. So the rules for the Holy Club, let me just say, the rules for the Holy Club in Oxford, where the Wesleys and Whitefield were members, was this. It was to systematically serve God every hour of the day. every hour of the day. They were to set aside time for praying, examining their spiritual life, studying the Bible, and meeting together. In addition, they took food to poor families. They visited lonely people in prison, taught orphans how to read, and members of the organization celebrated Holy Communion frequently. And in those days, that wasn't, you would probably celebrate Holy Communion once a month in church, and fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays until 3 p.m. And fellows of the Holy Club were also very much into studying scriptures as well. In fact, Samuel Wesley, John and Charles's father, was a huge advocate for the societies, and Susanna Wesley began one in the rectory kitchen that Samuel Wesley was ministering from the rectory of the church that Samuel Wesley was ministering at. So, huge effect. In the American colonies, there were two very important people in the precursor to the Great Awakening. In New England, you had a guy called Solomon Stoddard. They don't have names like this anymore. Solomon Stoddard, who ministered in the same church for 60 years in Massachusetts, Northampton, Massachusetts. And Solomon Stoddard was so important to the Christian DNA of that area. He was nicknamed, and this is a Puritan, right? Solomon Stoddard was a Puritan outlook. He was named the Pope of Northampton, which is quite funny. So between 1679 and 1718, Solomon experienced 5 periods of revivals in his ministry. And what's most important is that Solomon Stoddard, as he reached retirement age, decided to appoint his grandson to succeed him as the minister of his church. And his grandson was Jonathan Edwards. So after Solomon died in 1727, Jonathan Edwards becomes the minister, and he himself experienced a revival just before the Great Awakening in 1734. And so a very important aspect to this. In the middle colonies, we had a German-born minister from Poland, a Dutch Reformed minister called Theodore Jacobus Fringlinghuysen, I think I've pronounced that right, who was ministering at the same time in the middle colonies of America. Let me just say, you can buy a book of his sermons. I don't know if you can see that. A very good precursor. That's him on a horse. Very nice. Excellent. Very good sermons. Powerful if you read them. But he was ministering at the same time, and he had many revivals in the middle colonies in the early 1720s and 1730s. So that's kind of the precursors of just a few examples of the precursors that were happening towards the Great Awakening. Let me just say, 1735 is a huge year for revivals, for the Great Awakening. Very significant year. It's the year that there was a mini revival that Edwards was experiencing in Northampton. But this 1735 was also a year whereby the Moravians established a colony in Georgia. That's a huge thing for the future. It's the same year that the Wesleys came to Georgia, 1735, as missionaries to the Indians. In fact, 1735 is the year when Wesley was on the ship coming over to Georgia. He was an Anglican priest, but not a Christian. Not as unusual as you think. Realized he had no security in God and was afraid to die when a huge storm hit their ship. And as he was terrified, he saw a group of Moravians singing praise songs during this storm, totally at peace. And he realized that there was something missing in his life. And this is the connection began with the Moravians for Wesley, 1735. Also in 1735, Daniel Rowlands and Howell Harris in Wales are converted. And 1735 is the year that George Whitefield is converted in Oxford. George Whitefield did not come from a wealthy family background. The Wesleys went to Oxford as full students, but But Whitefield had to attend in what was known as a servitude role because he didn't have the money to go to the college. In other words, he would serve other students in payment of tuition. He would receive his tuition in payment as he served other students. And this is how Whitefield came to know the Wesleys. And that's why he became a part of the Holy Club. Whitefield, ironically, did not seek ordination in the Church of England. Let me quote you from a biography of Whitefield that says this: at the early age of 22, Whitefield was admitted to holy orders by Bishop Benson of Gloucestershire on Trinity Sunday 1737. His ordination was not of his own seeking. The bishop heard of his character from Lady Selwyn and others, who sent for him, gave him 5 guineas to buy books, and offered to ordain him, though only 22 years of age, whenever he wished. This unexpected offer came to him when he was full of scruples about his own fitness for ministry. So Whitefield wasn't planning to enter holy orders in the Church of England, but it was literally presented to him out of the blue, and he does eventually get ordained. So he's ordained in 1736, a year after he's converted. And then his first sermon, he goes back home and preaches his first sermon having been ordained. And let me give you a description of that first sermon. Last Sunday, and this is from another book you should read, is George Whitefield's Journal. George Whitefield's Journal is an awesome book. Literally his journal entries, very powerful. Last Sunday in the afternoon, I preached my first sermon at the church of St. Mary Le Crypt, where I was baptized, and also first received the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Curiosity, as you may easily guess, drew a large congregation together upon this occasion. The sight, at first, a little awed me, but I was comforted with a heartfelt sense of the divine presence, and soon found the unspeakable advantage of having been accustomed to public speaking when a boy at school, and of exhorting the prisoners and poor people in their private houses while at university, in the Holy Club. By these means I was kept from being daunted overmuch. As I proceeded, I perceived a fire kindled, till at last, though so young and amidst a crowd of those who knew me in my childish days, I was enabled to speak with some degree of gospel authority. Some few mocked, but most seemed for the present struck, and I have since heard that a complaint was made to the bishop that I drove 15 people mad at the first sermon. The worthy prelate wished that madness might not be forgotten before next Sunday. In other words, the bishop said, no more madness. The madness he's talking of is conversions. People literally, 15 people were converted on his first sermon, having been ordained. Now, Whitefield was a preacher that had never been seen before. Most preaching at this point in history were lectures. If you were a Church of England minister, you would have read your script, usually with a monotone voice, and it was a lengthy script sometimes, and it was a moralization. It was some form of moral teaching that you wanted to get across. Whitefield was different. He was so unusual. He was animated, expressive, passionate. He was criticised for bringing the theatre into the pulpit because he was so animated. They thought he was performing. He was that different. So not long after his ordination, Whitefield consented to leave England and go and join the Wesleys in America, who'd already gone to Georgia. Whitefield embarked on a goodbye tour. He decided to travel to his hometown and then through various areas down to get his boat to say he was saying farewell to friends and families. And as he went, he preached this amazing preaching. He was a phenomenal preacher, and to great effect, to increasingly larger crowds as he went. Now, in God's providence, a number of things happened at this point which helped the Great Awakening. First, the ship that Whitefield was to sail on was persistently delayed for various reasons. And secondly, due to these delays, Whitefield continued to preach on an itinerant basis. He had a short time of being the chaplain at the Tower of London, but mainly he was doing itinerant preaching. The third thing that happened was that during this time, Harold Harris and Daniel Rowland began preaching in Wales at the same time. And Harold Harris and Daniel Rowland were instrumental in the revival, in the Welsh revival at that point. So the effects of Whitefield's preaching in London and the South, of Harold Harris and Daniel Rowland in Wales, literally begin the Great Awakening. Large crowds heard the gospel and were converted. Large crowds. There are accounts where churches are so full, people are hanging by the windows to hear, and outside trying to get into the church because there's no room. It was remarkable. In 1738, Whitefield leaves London for America, and he crosses over with with Wesley. The Wesleys are coming back while he's going, and they came back to England. So John Wesley comes back to England, having been struggling with his true lack of faith. He comes back to London, goes to the Fetter Lane Society, and there, hearing someone read from Luther's commentary on Romans, is converted to Christ. And in the weeks following his conversion, Wesley travels to Germany to speak with Count Zinzendorf, the Moravian leader, who then mentors Wesley for a number of years. He comes back to London, and what happens? Wesley begins to preach with power. And it's the same message that Whitefield had been preaching. New birth, not moral issues. New birth in Christ. The need for saving faith. And Wesley starts to preach in power. And this is effective, very powerful. We hear this and think, well, okay, this is good. But what we have to understand is this. Preaching about the new birth and saving faith was not what people heard in churches. They heard, as I said, moralizing sermons. This message of come to Christ, give your life to him, be converted, accept the cross, was powerful. And Wesley had great success, along with Harris and Rowland in Wales, preaching about salvation, coming into a living relationship with Christ. It's this preaching of new birth and saving faith which actually helps the revival grow, but also gets them banned from the churches. Wesley writes in his journal in October of 1738, "My brother and I are not permitted to preach in most of the churches in London." Why? Because it's causing a stir. He's going against, remember what we said about revivals? Established church comes against the revival because they're on the outside of it. And bishops were telling churches, close your doors, don't let the Wesleys preach in your church. In December 1738, Whitefield comes back from America, and him and Wesley start preaching alongside, not literally physically together, but at the same time. And the Spirit was moving powerfully. After one sermon at Great Helen's Church, Whitefield wrote in his diary, "There seems to be a great outpouring of the Spirit, and many were awakened." And then what happens? Whitefield shut out of the churches because he's preaching about salvation, a real living relationship with Christ. Let me just tell you this. At this point, 1738, 1739, Whitefield was on average speaking 27 times a week. 27 times a week. 9 sermons. This is what he says in his diary. 9 sermons a week and 18 expositions. What does that mean? Speaking, effectively, sermons at religious societies. So in various societies around London. So if you consider this, if he's doing this 7 days a week, he's speaking almost 4 times a day. And this is how powerful things are going. And in the midst of that, there is intense prayer. Remember we said about revival often begins after prayer. Sometimes you don't realize, but groups of people praying for years for revival. Consider, Wesley and Whitefield are preaching multiple times a day. And then Wesley writes this in his journal on 1st of January 1739. About 3 in the morning, we were continuing in prayer. The power of God came mightily upon us, in so much that many cried out for exceeding joy, and many fell to the ground. 3 a.m. So they've preached all day and then they go and pray. You wonder why we don't see revival. However, let me just say, in 1739, and a momentous and crucial event took place for the revival. In February 1739, Whitefield did something that was anathema to the clergy of the Church of England. He did something which was regarded as evil, effectively. He preached outdoors. It's the first time he did that in this country. He did it in America. But here in England, he preached outdoors. Open-air preaching was seen as a bad thing because it was outside the sanctified space of the Holy Church building. And Whitefield went and preached outside to a crowd of 20,000 people. And it's from that event that Whitefield then goes to Wesley and encourages him to do the same. Now, Wesley was from the established church, and he was reluctant. He did not want to preach outdoors, Wesley. He felt that he was, because he grew up as an Anglican clergyman, unconverted, but an Anglican clergyman. And then he got converted, but he was still reluctant. But Whitefield managed to persuade him, as do others. And he goes and he preaches, and he's tremendously effective. And this is where Wesley's ministry of outdoor preaching begins. He starts to preach outdoors to tens of thousands of people. Tens of thousands are being converted, affected by the Holy Spirit. And it's in 1739 that the revival reaches Scotland. I'm going to stop there, and we can carry on next week. But we'll stop there for some questions or discussion.